What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 175. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to cover today, including Congress giving away its war powers. I'm talking about Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to the Middle East and what he was plotting there, and then news on Africa where the U.S. is looking to ramp up its intervention. So, all that and more on today's show. Be sure to check out and share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and right now at the Institute, we have our fall fund drive going on, and so this is the best time to go and support the Institute. Of course, we take all kinds of cryptocurrencies, and there's plenty of reasons to support the Institute, like it goes to, making sure that people like Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, P. Quinones, Patrick McFarlane, Keith Knight, Tommy Solomons, Hunter DeRennis, Lori Calhoun, and Connor Freeman all have a place to publish the great libertarian work that we put out. Of course, so much of the really important work going on right now in libertarianism is coming from our institute, and so please go support that. And Scott has a bunch of great kit bags listed there, so you could get signed copies of Scott Horton books, any Libertarian Institute books, digital copies of the books. And I know Scott is getting pretty close to having the audiobook ready for Fool's Errand, or Enough Already. Fool's Errand's already done, so Enough Already. He'll have the audiobook out, and great time to go get it right now over at the Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/donate. You can also find the show, of course, on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. Follow the show social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. And then just the last thing, remember that the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde. Best CBD products on the market, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, to get yourself 25% off when you check out and spend $75 or more. All right, now let's get into the show. And the first thing we have up today is Congress looking to give away its war powers and basically give the president a blank check to make war with China over Taiwan. This was an op-ed published in the Washington Post by Representative Elaine Loria. And one of the reasons that this is significant is that this op-ed is backing, I think, a largely Republican bill that's being pushed called the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act. And so there's a couple good articles on this at Responsible Statecraft. That's the Quincy Institute, one by Elizabeth Beavers, and then the other one by Michael D. Swain. And the Beavers article I have up here first. But basically, she is saying that, Representative Loria is saying that it's an issue that the U.S. government the president doesn't have the power to just defend Taiwan with military force whenever he wants, and would need a presidential authorization to do so. Of course, this is specifically the way the Constitution was written, that it was meant that if the United States was going to get into a war, that Congress had to give express approval for that, and that the president can't just go and create any kind of conflict at once. Now, Beavers points out, and this is, I think, the most important part of her article, is that this is completely unneeded because we live in 2021 and not, right after the Constitution was written, and maybe there was still some thought that, Congress really would have to pass active wars. But, in this day and age, it doesn't happen. Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani. Obama overthrew Gaddafi in Libya and created the hell state that they have there now. We've, target all kinds of groups across the Middle East, always claiming that they're the, 2001 AUMF that we're using for this, even if the groups that we're attacking are actually directly opposed to Al-Qaeda linked jihadists. So it's all completely insane how war powers currently works in 2021, and this bill is completely 100% unnecessary. But if the Congress did move forward with it, one of the real issues would be is if you had a president who just perceived that for whatever reason, whether it was bad intelligence, whether the president was paranoid, whether maybe there was some real or partially real threat, maybe it was a misunderstanding understanding, whatever. If the president thought that China was going to invade Taiwan, that they could just use military action without getting approval from the Congress, as should be in the Constitution. If anything, what Congress should be doing right now is passing bills that specifically say that the president cannot go to war, or just repealing the current AUMFs and passing resolutions that specifically cut against things like the War Powers Act and make it very clear what the constitutional and the original intent of the founders were when they wrote the Constitution and gave Congress the war-making abilities. Wasn't that, so the president could go start an offensive war and they get approval from Congress later, or carry out a massive drone war on two continents, two of the world's largest continents, all the way from Africa to the Philippines, and pretend like this is something that Congress has given approval for, or something like that. This needs to be reined in by Congress, not the other way. Now, the Swain article goes through, and I think the most important point in here is just that this shows the utter lack of understanding that Congress has for foreign policy. So they pretend like China could just launch a surprise attack, like, one day tomorrow, without a military buildup at all. China would just be able to go and invade Taiwan, pull essentially a Pearl Harbor, except they, take and occupy the island, where if, China really did want to launch an offensive war against Taiwan, it would take a huge amount of assets, and it would ultimately involve a very large military buildup across the Taiwan Strait from China. Maybe not exactly right. There would be other assets deployed to other areas, but essentially you would see them moving into position. A naval blockade can't be established overnight if China doesn't have the military assets in the proper positions to do so. And so just on the face of it, what Representative Loria is saying is just utterly stupid. Again, just goes to show how little Congress understands foreign policy whatsoever. But Swain goes through and made some other important points in here. But I think the main thing that I want to stress that I actually got from a recent episode of the Scott Horton Show, where he interviews the great Peter Van Buren, who is known for being something of like an Iraq war whistleblower, because he worked for the State Department and wrote the book We Meant Well, and exposed how the U.S. humanitarian intervention in Iraq after Iraq War II was actually causing more harm than good. But really, he spent most of his career in Asia, involved in diplomacy and everything like that. And one of the things that he makes very clear in the interview is just, we're not on the cusp. And it would be very, very unlikely for China to just go and launch a war against Taiwan because of the cultural ties between China and Taiwan, and so many people in each country viewing the people there as their kinsmen. This would be equivalent to a civil war. And I think the U.S., especially in the U.S. media and the way Americans look at it, is almost like Iran and Iraq, where a war could break out any time and these tensions always exist. And while there has been tensions between China and Taiwan for decades on end now, and a lot of that fueled by the United States, and especially in recent years, all the military support and the military buildup that we've had around Taiwan, it's important to remember that unlike Iran, Iraq, this is a situation where everybody feels that they're kin, and that makes it far less likely that they would go to war. And I'll link to and really recommend that episode of the Scott Horton Show. Peter Van Buren, as always, is absolutely brilliant, and the way he articulates from his experience in the region how unlikely it would be that a war would break out. Not, I guess, necessarily some kind of larger conflict, but that China and Taiwan would go to war with each other. And it seems to me that the real risk here is the U.S. and China ending up in some kind of conflict. Now, let's just say Representative Loria, I think, got what they wanted here, which was a more firm U.S. military commitment to Taiwan. I think the U.S. is now in a position where the more military assets it commits to Taiwan, the more China will respond by building up militarily across the strait, and also just to develop more and more military capabilities to counter that. And so the more the U.S. escalates, the more it's going to feel like it can never turn down. So once we had 2,000 troops there, we can never go back to having 1,000, that kind of situation. Because going backwards, China has since put more military capabilities in the region, and so then it would put Taiwan at a greater and greater disadvantage. And that's one reason I think this is a real trap the U.S. could get sucked into. And I don't know about war breaking out anytime soon, but at the very least, us wasting a huge amount of money and, potentially some small conflicts or something like that erupting even from misunderstanding or mistakes. Let's see. One other thing here on China. The U.S., this from David Camp at antiwar.com. The U.S. accuses Cambodia of a lack of transparency over Chinese construction. There is a military base, a naval base in Cambodia, the Ream Naval Base, and the U.S. has long been accusing Cambodia of allowing China to build a secret naval base there, and Cambodia has always denied this. Recently, the Center for the Strategic Institute, Strategic International Studies, I think CSIS, put out a report. Center for Strategic and International Studies put out a report that claimed that, from the satellite footage, that there was maybe some questionable things being built by the Chinese military there. And so now the U.S. is claiming that Cambodia has a lack of transparency. I mean, my big issue here isn't whether China is building a military base or not, but it's that the U.S. has absolutely no responsibility role whatsoever in telling China what to do, or Cambodia what to do, and what kind of ties they could have with China and what China is going to do in Cambodia. This is the furthest place on the planet from the U.S., and it couldn't be less important. I'm guessing that the amount of Americans that could find Cambodia on a map is probably not much better than they do with a country like Iran, so it's just obviously not of importance to the American people. All right, let's talk about Antony Blinken's trip to the Middle East. One of the first things that we have is the U.S. says it is moving forward with its plans to reopen its Palestinian mission in Jerusalem. So when the Trump administration decided to move its Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which really upset the Palestinians because it was an indication that the U.S. was recognizing Israel as the sole controlling power of Jerusalem, which was supposed to be like a shared capital city in the two-state solution. And in a lot of ways, it just goes to show that the Americans aren't interested in any way in the two-state solution. It's just a way at this point to drag the Palestinians along and pretend that we're giving them real offers when we're not. And so when the Trump administration moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it also either, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, closed or consolidated. Depending on how you look at how the Trump administration will put it, that the building or the office it used to traditionally have diplomacy and engage with the Palestinians was just folded into or completely closed the Israeli embassy that was now in Jerusalem. The Biden administration took over, and rather than going back and moving the U.S. Embassy back to Tel Aviv and resetting the kind of U.S.-Israeli policy to where it was under the Biden administration, went ahead and endorsed the Trump move, But like I think 6 months down the road, start to float the idea of reopening the Palestinian mission, and I guess this that maybe they see as something of a little nod towards the Palestinians. The Israelis have opposed this pretty forcefully. The government, Naftali Bennett, has been saying that no way are you going to do this. But Antony Blinken said that the U.S. was going to go ahead with it. Now, it's worth noting that the State Department did not give a date on when this new mission will be opened, and so it could be one of those government projects that's just perpetually under construction. At the same time, it is something that could be happening. One of the interesting things is, this is something that I think probably doesn't mean a whole lot to the average Palestinians. Maybe it means something a little bit to the Palestinian leadership, but at this point, there hasn't been, elections in Palestine since I think 2006, when I wasn't even old enough, wouldn't have been old enough to vote. And so most, I think Palestinians at this point, especially those in Gaza, certainly wouldn't have been old enough to vote in the last election there. And so the politicians that represent the Palestinians actually probably aren't very representative of them, even by standards that we see in the United States. Now, let's move on real quick and talk about another Blinken statement, and this one on the Abraham Accords. And these were, of course, rolled out, I think, in 2020, towards the end of the Trump administration. And they were, I think, a set of 4 normalization agreements between different Arab states or Muslim majority states and Israel. So this was the UAE was one of the first, but this wasn't really, what you would typically think or consider a diplomatic agreement. The U.S. had agreed to sell the Emirates, and the Biden administration has moved through with this $23 billion worth of advanced weaponry, including F-35s and armed drones. And so this is pretty concerning that the U.S. is moving forward with this, giving Israel this or the Emirates that much more military technology, which essentially just kicked off an arms race with Israel, because they say the U.S. has a policy that says Israel has to have significantly advanced weaponry compared to the other Gulf Arab states, and so the U.S. needs to sell Israel more upgraded weaponry because of the deal with the UAE. The U.S. also cut a deal with Sudan, and with Sudan, it required that government to pay, I think, $300 million to U.S. families who are victims of one of Osama bin Laden's attacks, even though the Sudanese a couple of years before, or a year before actually, had overthrown the longtime dictator of Sudan, who was in charge when bin Laden was there. And then Sudan, with that payment plus normalizing ties with Israel, was taking off the state sponsor of terror list. The U.S. also normalized relations with the U.S. also facilitated Israel normalizing relations with Mozambique, or not Mozambique, excuse me, with Morocco. And with Morocco, the deal was that the U.S. would essentially give a rubber stamp and announce, change their policy from opposing to supporting the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, which I'm not going to get into a whole lot right now, but is essentially a human rights nightmare there in West Africa. And so, this was what the U.S. called diplomacy. And rather than, scoffing at it as you would think Biden's Secretary of State would, the U.S. has rather looked to build on this. Now, one of the things that the Palestinians at least felt was a result of the Abraham Accords was they were cut out of agreements from Arab states or Muslim states that said they would not normalize relations with Israel until Israel stopped treating the Palestinians like garbage. And what has happened is that these states have normalized relations with Israel before, and while Israel was actually treating Palestinians continually worse and worse and worse. And so, Palestine didn't like the Abraham Accords. And here you have Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, inexplicably saying that he thinks building on the Abraham Accords can help diplomacy between Israel and Palestine. And so there's two possibilities here. One is that our Secretary of State is incompetent, and I think this is probably the more likely one, that he really just thinks that, this was Jewish Muslim diplomacy, and therefore it must be good towards normalizing relations between Israel and Palestine, even though the Palestinians were opposed to this. Or this is sadistic, and what the U.S. is trying to do, and what even under the Biden administration now, and I think this was the Trump plan, was to cut off Palestine from more and more of its Arab allies, further and further isolating, the people that are subject to Israel's apartheid policies and live in a state where they don't have rights because of the, where their ancestry is, right? That by cutting off all the Palestinians' Arab allies and everything, that will essentially put them in a weaker and weaker diplomatic position and force them to eventually just accept whatever garbage deal that Israel and the United States ends up offering up. And I'm not quite sure which of the two things it is in there. It kind of seems like it might be the second one too, because Blinken said this could be used as leverage, although it's not exactly clear how this would be used as leverage against Israel, since the U.S. in all these agreements has essentially bent over backwards to make these countries do the deals with Israel. Now, let's see, what else do we have on Blinken's trip? So Blinken's trip to the Middle East, he was going to go meet with the Israeli foreign minister Yair Lapid, and then he was going to go and meet with the Emirati foreign minister, and then he was going to meet with the two together, and that was going to be somewhat of a significant event, because Israel, I don't think, has had that high level of a meeting with a U.S. official and then an official of another Gulf Arab state. And so these meetings were happening, and one of the main things to come out of the first meeting, again, the U.S.-Israel meeting, is that Blinken and was very hawkish towards Iran. He said, time is running out and we are prepared to turn to other options if Iran doesn't change course. And these consultations with our allies and partners are a part of that. And then the Israeli foreign minister Lapid made clear that Blinken's other options are a threat, saying, I would like to start by repeating what the Secretary of State just said. Yes, other options are going to be on the table if diplomacy fails. And by saying other options, I think everybody understands here in Israel, in the Emirates, and in Tehran what it is that we mean. And this is, very, very clearly a threat here. So we also have a statement, and Dave DeCamp highlights this in his article, from Robert Malley, saying that the U.S. is preparing for other options. Of course, this is disappointing. One of the few signals that we had from the Biden administration, and that was interested in genuine diplomacy with Iran, was the appointment of Robert Malley as the special envoy for Iran, because he had been a part of the Obama team that successfully negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA. Back in the Obama administration. And so bringing him back in suggested that maybe they were looking to repeat that level of diplomacy. However, he hasn't been very optimistic about the entire time, and seems to be just as willing to go along with this very aggressive and hawkish strategy that Biden is moving forward with, being completely unwilling to offer the Iranians anything to bring them back into talks. Along with what was happening between the foreign ministers, we had a statement from Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and he said that continued continued the threats against Iran by saying that there were non-peaceful ways to deal with Iran. I'm guessing that so there's this really backwards thing that happens in like international affairs where sanctions are referred to as like peaceful options because you're not actively bombing people, starving people to death, by the view of the members of the world empire is an act of peaceful negotiation, where if you were if you were, let's say, bombing somebody, then that would not be peaceful. And so I think that's what Israel's prime minister is saying there. To back up his statements, or to, say that present a need to act out non-peacefully against Iran, he says Iran is blatantly violating the IAEA commitments. And this is one of the most hypocritical statements you could possibly imagine a politician saying. I mean, this is a whopper by any standards, as Israel is a country outside of the non-proliferation treaty that has nuclear weapons, a completely unregulated nuclear weapon state. And so to condemn another country for having any kind of unregulated nuclear program is a complete joke and a farce, and he should be laughed out of the room for it. And then the other issue is, of course, is that one of the places Iran is, said to not be complying with the IAEA is at the surveillance as Kraja facility, where Israel carried out an attack on the facility and damaged the IAEA cameras that Iran later took down. And so it's very interesting that Israel is blaming Iran for not living up to the IAEA protocols when they're one of the states that is actively making sure Iran isn't meeting them, because they're blowing up the IAEA cameras. This is absolutely insane. We also had the Israeli foreign minister claim that Iran is becoming a nuclear threshold state. This is an interesting term. There may be a little bit of like kind of truth to it. Scott Horn talks about how Iran is either has or is probably like on the verge of having a like Japanese style latent nuclear deterrent, which means that if like some country went to war with Iran, or was, Iran really felt like they needed to, for whatever reason, decide to build a nuclear weapon, they would be able to do so with the technology, that they have, the nuclear energy technology that they have, the nuclear reactors that they have, what they know, how they know to refine the nuclear waste and to spin it in centrifuge it and make it a high enough level to make a nuclear bomb. Maybe my guess would be that Iran is probably significantly and meaningfully further from that than the Japanese, but at the same time, within like a year or so, like if Iran really, really just dedicated itself, if the U.S. started to wage an open war on Iran, then, maybe Iran could develop a nuclear weapon in that time. But the Israelis are trying to make it out like Iran at any time could develop their nuclear weapon, and that is something they're trying to do, which is very clearly not the case. And so it's just a very interesting way that this is being phrased, especially because at this point, Iran has only enriched uranium up to 60%, where you would need at least 90% for it to be weapons grade. So Blinken had a warning to Israel during their meeting. This didn't have anything to do with like, hey, we're really trying to get back within the Iran nuclear deal, so can you please not, carry out any attacks against the Iranians, threaten the Iranians anytime soon. But rather what Blinken warned Israel about was too much cooperation with China. This is echoing the statement that William Burns, the CIA director, raised when he was in Israel in August, and so this really isn't a surprise surprise at all, but that it came up from the State Department as well. I think is really trying to tell Israel, like, hey, we really don't care so much about the Palestinians. We're like, kind of concerned about reopening diplomatic mission, not so much concerned about what you do in Syria or the warfare against Iran or the threats against Iran, the preventing the U.S. from engaging in diplomacy with Iran. But any kind of investment that China has in Israel is completely unacceptable to us. And this is just the absolute insanity of current U.S. foreign policy. I'm not surprised at this by all. China's the big bad, and so we're willing to, make all these other concessions, even as we go around the world saying, we're the promoters of democracy, and Israel, we're the promoters of apartheid and authoritarianism, and we're willing to support that and have no problem supporting that as long as we could put some pressure on Israel not to get too close with China. Israel also carried out some airstrikes in Syria. These hit the Palmyra region, which is somewhat significant as Russia has a series of bases in that region. The Reuters article I have here frames this all as, it's Iran, and this is just Israel and Iranian proxy war, not this is Israel carrying out a war against Assad's Shia forces in Syria that if they weren't fighting against Israel or weren't concerned about Israeli airstrikes, they would be probably carrying out operations against ISIS. And so this is, in a roundabout way, strikes that are beneficial to the Islamic State or the Al-Qaeda safe haven, the Al-Nusra safe haven in the north of the country in the Idlib province. And so, these strikes the U.S. shouldn't support for that reason. All the better if Assad consolidates power over Syria at this point, finishes mopping up the jihadist threats in his country. And while he is by, no means a great guy, there's not going to be democratic rule in Syria. Allow the Syrian people to work out their problems with their leaders, because when the U.S. gets involved, we create the Islamic State. But that is what Israel is encouraging with these airstrikes. Now, I made the point on the last show, actually, that at some point, Syria cannot just allow the U.S., Turkey, and jihadists to control large portions of this territory, especially the U.S., where that territory is very lucrative. And then it can't allow Israel forever to carry out airstrikes against Syrian targets and just, bomb near downtown Damascus, bomb near Palmyra. And in response to this strike, the Shia militia said that they would be looking to exact revenge against Israel. Not sure how it's going to happen. It could be simple as shelling into the Golan Heights or something like that, or it could be far more covert and timed for later. We see 2 or 3 months from now some kind of missile be launched into Israel, or some kind of Israeli assets in the region be targeted in some way by these Shia militias. So definitely worth keeping an eye on. But it's worth knowing that not just this strike near Palmyra, which is an escalation. Usually they bomb around Damascus and try to hit these facilities where it's Iranian, where they're backing Assad, where they're helping to train, fund, arm militias and stuff like that. They're hitting those facilities. They're hitting Assad's facilities. Here they're hitting targets that are near Russian facilities. And so I think for that reason, it's a little bit of an escalation, but it's also, worth noting that this actually came from Jordanian airspace, where Israel typically carries out these airstrikes from Lebanese airspace, and maybe it has something to do with Syria increasing air defenses in different regions of the country. It's unclear as to why, but Israel has also carried out drone strikes near the Deir al-Zor region of Syria. This is closer to the Syrian-Iraqi border, near where the U.S. is occupying Syria along the Euphrates River Valley, that Israel is carrying out these strikes. And I think there is a specific reason for this, and we see it in the Reuters article, where everything is portrayed as Israel versus Iran. And so even if there isn't isn't anything here that in any way suggests that even if these militias are Iranian backed, they're not doing anything to Israel. They're just in Syria, mainly acting as Assad's forces as he looks to consolidate control over his own country. Not even the disputed Golan Heights, but, to finally wipe out the terrorists that have for an entire decade now plagued Syria. That's what these forces' main objective is. And Israel continues to carry out these airstrikes is, no doubt in part to provoke and the very least in the U.S. media, inflate the narrative of Israel versus Iran to make it absolutely impossible and to put more political pressure on Biden not to return to the Iran nuclear deal negotiations. One of the more sadistic things we have, the Secretary of State, and this is the last story about his press, about his little tour to the Middle East, saying that the U.S. opposes the reconstruction of Syria. This is one of those things that makes me actually sick, and I even hate talking about it, really, because it is just so outrageous and disgusting that after a 10-year long civil war, even if you don't like Assad, he now controls Damascus. He's not going anywhere. The revolution with the U.S.-backed jihadists failed, and it's time to admit that with the millions of people that are in Syria, they need to rebuild their country. Essential infrastructure, being able to get water and fuel and electricity, repair the roads and bridges, all this needs to be done in Syria. And the U.S. is specifically preventing it with its Caesar Act sanctions that target the energy and construction centers. The U.S. is making sure that Syria can't be rebuilt, punishing every Syrian citizen, starving some to death, making sure that the young Syrian children don't have access to the medical care they need to survive. And the U.S. is willing to do this because we don't like the leader Bashar al-Assad, and we say he's bad to his own people. Well, we're bad to all the Syrian people. And it's just unbelievable that the Secretary of State will say something like this and isn't met with a ton of outrage. All right, moving on to Iraq, where we had a recent election with record low voter turnout. The voter turnout for the election was only 41%. And it's very funny that the U.S. will tout how it built democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that, when never in any of these elections does it feel like anything but corruption happened. And now only 41% of people are turning out. The low voter turnout, this is by Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, was a result of voter disillusionment and boycotts. There's a lot of different sectors of the Iraqi society that just decided it wasn't worth going out and voting. Early vote results show that it was the Sadrist bloc. This is led by Muqtada al-Sadr. He is an Iraqi cleric whose father was a very important Iraqi figure. I believe he was either killed or assassinated by Saddam Hussein. And Sadr has several times in Iraq been in the position where he should be kingmaker, at least. Although, as Elijah Magnier has pointed out, he oftentimes doesn't seem to know what he really wants or needs to do with the political power that he has. But nonetheless, it appears that his bloc got the most seats, although it's unclear of how many. Initially it was reported as 73, but it has gone down to 69. As usual with Iraqi elections, it takes a couple weeks to figure everything out, and then after that it's an entire mess as they actually try to form a government. And so I'll cover this more on shows to come. The main reason I want to actually cover this today, because I was just going to wait probably at least another week before I talked about it, was I screwed up in my news roundup at the Libertarian Institute and had put that the voter turnout was 25%. It was just a mistype on my part, a complete, just stupid mistake. But anyways, I wanted to bring it up on the show just because I know it's a few days old news roundup now, a good chance that some people won't go back and look at and see the correction. But I think most people who read the roundup listen to the show, and so you'll get it correct here. That way nobody in my audience is saying anything wrong. All right, let's talk about the capture of. I'm gonna pronounce this name wrong, but at least it looks like Sammy Jasmine, and he was apparently the deputy, or at least is claimed to be the deputy of the now deceased leader of ISIS, Baghdadi, and it is apparently that this guy was captured actually in Syria by Iraqi forces working with Turkish forces. And I don't know, this is just a very interesting story. Turkey and Iraq have their own disputes over Turkish presence in northern Iraq. There's actually Turkish military bases, Turkish military presence in northern Iraq that Iraq opposes, and they can't get the Turks out of their country. But they did work together on this. Apparently, Jasmine was taken from from Syria first to Turkey and then to Iraq. I don't actually anticipate this will have any impact on jihad, ISIS in Iraq or Syria. Typically, in these groups, when you know kill or take out the leadership, you don't get a whole lot from this. But maybe by capturing this guy, they could gain some intelligence or something like that. And it does go to show, I think, that when you look at the Middle East and what to do with these jihadist groups, what does the U.S. have to do? Well, even countries like Iraq and Syria, that are Iraq and Turkey, that have their own disputes, are able to put them aside to take out a bigger threat like the Islamic State. One last story here on Turkey, and that is they're looking to buy about 40 F-16s from the Air Force. The reason that Turkey is looking to buy F-16s is because they were initially part of the F-35 project with the United States and I think 30-something other countries. But now Turkey was cut out of that project because they elected to buy the Russian S-400 air defense system. The U.S. threatened, said you can't buy it, you can't buy it, you can't buy it. You gotta buy the U.S.-made Patriot missile systems. Of course, this is, just strong-armed mercantilism, but nonetheless, Turkey is now in a position where they're looking to buy these F-16s, and so just something to keep an eye on in the Middle East coming up. There's this big story out on Lebanon today where it looks like several people were killed during a protest, and so I want to break this down because the way I've seen it portrayed in the media is kind of spun against Hezbollah, and it seems, if anything, the Shiites are the victims of this. And so you kind of have to go back a full year to understand what's going on here. You had that massive explosion in the port of Beirut where I forget how many people died, but it looked like it was a very scary explosion. I mean, mushroom cloud blew out windows for miles around. Absolutely crazy scenes in Beirut from that explosion. But, they've been trying to figure out who's responsible, and it seems at least that they're looking as this is a problem of negligence, right? And so there's a court that's looking to decide that. I believe, this is my understanding, that the Hezbollah and Amal militia, which represent mostly the Shia in Lebanon, they're a political group as well as, militia groups. And so they organized a protest, I believe, against the court, because I think the court was going to find that it was Shia officials that were in some way responsible for this. And so they organized this protest at a point in the city of Beirut where the Shia section meets the, I believe, Christian section. Shots rang out and there were 6 Shia killed. It's pretty clear from some footage that there were at least 2 or 3 bodies taken away that did not appear that the people were in any way armed or prepared to be, they could have been members of like Hezbollah's militia or something like that, but they were certainly dressed as civilians and just, on the street. you could be a soldier and have an opinion and protest, I suppose. Anyways, it appears, at least from all the early reporting, that the only people killed were Shia, since Shia were killed, although at some point some members of either Hezbollah or the Amal militia returned fire. At least one person, one Shia woman, was killed in her home, and at that point, that's all I know. From international reporting, mainstream Western press are saying that there's been various explosions and the sounds of gunfire every hour or two in the city since. Although I'm not sure how much of that is confirmed or could even, just be misreported loud sounds that people are saying is gunfire. Anyways, I wanted to talk about this and just get out in front of it a little bit because I think it's going to be spun into like anti-Iran, anti-Hezbollah propaganda. Just a few quick stories on Africa before I wrap up here. The first is from Reuters, and they report that they spoke with a spokesperson from the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, and this is an ethnic group in the north of Ethiopia, Tigray, the Tigrayan people. It's on the border of Ethiopia and Eritrea, this region. And in November 2020, the government of Ethiopia, depending on what side of this you want to look at, started a offensive or went to quell a uprising in the Tigray region. Again, this is in November of 2020. Last May, the May of 2021, we had statements from the Ethiopian government that their occupation or offensive was ending in Tigray and that their soldiers would be leaving the area. Although when we actually saw what happened at the time, it looked a hell of a lot more like the TPLF had gotten their ranks together and had actually run out the Ethiopian army. Over the summer, the TPLF gained territory not only in Tigray, but also in the neighboring Amhara region, and also I've read reports of the Afar region. And so what the Tigrayans are now alleging is that the Ethiopian government has opened up attacks on, I believe, where they are holding territory in the Amhara region and also some in Tigray. And some of this is being carried out with airstrikes. Now, from what I could tell, the Western press seems to fairly uncritically air the TPLF side on these issues, and it seems that the TPLF, this was like the faction in Ethiopia that was in charge, say, going back to 2006, when the U.S. Facilitated the Ethiopians going into Sudan, or not Sudan, Somalia, and taking out the Islamic Courts Union. And so from my perspective, it seems like this is kind of the Western sock puppet side, and my concern would be that any misreporting going on is unfairly reporting bias in favor of the TPLF. But I'm not always certain on that. Just want to make that clear, as I'm doing my best to figure out what's happening in a region in the world where there's not a whole lot of, and especially not a lot of good English media coming from it. Now, one of the reasons why this is important, what's happening in Ethiopia, is because U.S. AID Director Samantha Power has said that she smells a genocide in that country, and anywhere Samantha Power smells a genocide, she is going to look to get very involved. Now, this is actually coming from the State Department, not Sam Power. It's the spokesperson, Ned Price, saying that the U.S. is considering a full range of tools to use in response to reports of Ethiopian government launching an offensive against the northern Tigray region. It doesn't even sound like the U.S. or the State Department, at the very least, has good intelligence on what's going on there. They just have reports that this is happening, so probably just heard from the TPLF it was going on, and they're looking at sanctions against Ethiopia for doing this. Again, they're going to portray this, as this a nonviolent way to deal with the problem, even though it's going to starve and make the situation worse for the people of Ethiopia. Now, Biden will be meeting this week with the president of Kenya, Kenyatta, and that meeting is going to actually happen in the White House. It's the first African leader to meet with Biden, and I think this is probably a pretty lucrative meeting for Kenyatta. And the U.S. White House spokesperson Jen Psaki said that the meeting would be to discuss efforts to defend democracy and human rights, advance peace and security, and accelerate economic growth and tackle climate change. And so, of course, with this country being a neighbor of Ethiopia, you have to think that part of this is going to be, the Biden administration meddling more in that region and in Ethiopia. One other thing going on, I think worth mentioning, is that the meeting will come as the World Court, it's the International Court of Justice, is ruling against Kenya and more favorably for Somalia in a sea border dispute. There's a region of the Indian Ocean that's disputed whether it should be considered Somali or Kenyan territorial waters. It's believed that there's important oil and gas resources there, and the World Court, the International Court of Justice, has signaled that it's going to adopt almost the Somali map. And so with that, Kenya announced that they were no longer participating in the talks, and not talks, that they were no longer recognizing the authority of the ICJ. And I do expect this to come up at the meeting with Biden. And it's just, you're going to wonder what Biden's willing to trade away to get what he wants elsewhere in the region. Of course, the U.S. government has had a big hand in creating the current Somali government, and of course has just so much power as the world empire, being able to give out aid. How much pressure could they put on Somalia to take a more favorable approach here towards Kenya on this sea border dispute? All right, everyone, that's what I have for the show today. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. Please share it. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, where we're holding our fall fund drive. The only thing I'm going to plug is go check out the Institute and donate to the fund drive. And then the show sponsor, Paloma Verde, use the promo code PEACE. Thanks, everyone.